In today's episode, we are joined in the Infinite Library by special guest Eden from the wonderful Death Sentence podcast. Today's book is John M. Ford's influential but little-known 1983 historical fantasy novel, The Dragon Waiting. Being both a gentleman and a scholar, Eden brings the classic death sentence embarrassment of riches to today's discussion, covering historical fantasy as a genre, Welsh folklore, and French and Italian history. We also discuss Ford's background in role-playing games and dungeon mastering, and we pitch our proposed 3-book adaptations of The Dragon Waiting's massive and dense story. As such, a brief overview of the story is needed before we dive in. The Dragon Waiting is set in a world where Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate successfully mandated religious pluralism as a Roman rule of law. With this fantastic what if, the world of Dragon Waiting introduces several big differences to our own world, namely that the Byzantine Empire has become the global power of medieval Europe. Also, magic exists, and vampires, which, according to the book, is just a disease, like gout or pissing sugar. Our story follows a band of heroes, or in the parlance of Dungeons & Dragons, true companions, as they attempt to prevent the Byzantine Empire from taking over England. While this includes a few side adventures, as any good D&D campaigns should, such as a locked room Swiss hotel murder mystery, the main plot involves ensuring Richard III wins the Battle of Bosworth, thus seizing the throne and preventing the Tudors from becoming the dynasty we know today. Ford's depiction of Richard III is not the villainous monstrosity of Shakespeare's invention, nor the saintly figure of recent historical rediscovery, but somewhere in between. Our cast of characters includes Howell Paradur, a one-eyed Welsh wizard who seeks an end to the Byzantine Empire, Cynthia Ritchie, a master physician and disguise artist from Medici-era Italy, Dimitros Doukas, a Greek soldier and the one true heir to the Byzantine throne, and Gregory von Bayern, a German vampire who specializes in guns. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
Welcome to the Infinite Library, everybody. Thank you for tuning in for your regular bi-weekly episode. We have a special treat for you today. We have a special guest. Joining us today to discuss The Dragon Waiting by John M. Ford is Eden of the phenomenal Death Sentence podcast, as well as AnarchySF and Heavy Blog is Heavy. Is that everything, Eden, or is there anything else you want to...
There's a bunch more things, but those are the main things. Hi, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. Of course.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've been a Death Sentence listener since early COVID. And
my condolences.
Well, you and Langdon's 3-hour episodes were a huge help to me. I was a delivery driver at the time, so they took up a good chunk of my shift. So they were a big inspiration for our show too. So
cool.
Yeah. Cool.
Happy to be here.
We're talking about, like I said, The Dragon Waiting by John M. Ford today, which is a phenomenal, I think, work of fantasy fiction described as the velvet underground of 80s fantasy in the introductory essay to my edition.
Is that Neil Gaiman's introduction?
That was Scott Lynch's introduction.
Scott Lynch.
In the 2021 edition.
So the thing that's super interesting about, that's why they call it the Velvet Underground. Velvet Underground is famously a musician's favorite band, right? Like they inspired so many artists to make music in the late 80s and the 90s, but they only enjoyed the commercial success or like mainstream acclaim very, very late in their career. And John Ford basically never enjoyed any sort of mainstream recognition. He won the World Fantasy Award, but that doesn't really mean anything because the people who sit on the World Fantasy panel are also, niche kind of like celebrities within the scene. But people like Neil Gaiman, Scott Lynch, Robert Jordan, and other names from like the SFF, American SFF scene, literally call him like the best SFF author ever. And then no one knows him.
Yeah.
Literally. That's just no one knows him.
I had not heard about him at all. And I've been reading, guys like Gaiman, Robert Jordan, Joe Walton, all the kind of names who really praise him for years. And like, this is just he'd never had been on my radar until Tor put out this edition in 2021.
A part of it is because a lot of his books went out of print after he died. And it kind of took a long while for Tor Books to get in touch with his family, the people who inherited like the IP for his the rights to print his work. And they were only able to do that in 2020. That's when The Dragon Waiting came back in print. And now there's actually been a posthumous publication of Aspects in 2022, which is last novel that he never finished. And that has like Neil Gaiman all over it. And I think he pushed for its publication. But like if you look back at his career, you know, he's won the Philip K. Dick Award, the World Fantasy Award. He wrote for Star Trek. He wrote like tie-in novels, and he wrote for the Star Trek role-playing game.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because like he was the first person to write like a novel set in the Klingon universe. And like, and he was the first person to be like, well, what if we took this sort of culture seriously? And then the second one he wrote was like a comedy. And if you look up reviews of it, people are mad because they're like, I want the serious Star Trek novel. I don't want a Gilbert and Sullivan comedy musical, which to me just like shows that he has like incredible range for like what he's able to do.
And he was also co-published with Gene Wolfe, right? Like his stuff appeared.
Oh, nice.
Like in a double publication. Tor used to have this thing called Tor SF Double, where they would publish 2 novellas in one edition. And he was published alongside Gene Wolfe. So like this guy worked with everyone. He was Robert Jordan's best friend. And Robert Jordan was his best friend. Robert Jordan is one of the biggest blockbuster bestsellers in American fantasy and just fantasy in general. But somehow John Ford's works they never got recognition. Part of it, by the way, is because of that range that you pointed out, Ben.
Yeah.
This guy could not choose a genre, right? Yeah. He's done space opera, historical fantasy, Star Trek, urban magic. I've never read it, but The Last Hot Time is like this urban fantasy kind of vibe. He's also credited for some proto-cyberpunk. He released like cyberpunk-ish stuff. His debut is like cyberpunk-ish. So maybe that's part of it, right? Like he wrote something out of everything. So maybe people couldn't like, grab onto his genre. By the way, one last tidbit and then I'll shut up. He also wrote for Traveler, which is one of the OG role-playing games, like a D&D competitor back in the 80s, phenomenal science fiction game. And he wrote, when I say wrote, he didn't like write a blurb or something. He wrote like 40% of some of the books. He wrote like extensively for Traveler. So yeah, very interesting person.
Did you see he won an award for the scenario he wrote for Paranoia, I think?
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting. We don't have to jump into this now, but I think many people have pointed out his affinities between his fiction and game mastering. And John was mentioning to me that a lot of his ethos seems to be like interesting characters and interesting situations, which like is sort of like what you'd want to do if you're like a good game master. And we could maybe talk about that when we get into the book, but I think that's something you can see just because he did all of that writing for game mastering. So
yeah, that's very interesting. He also worked on if we want to get into his gaming career, which is interesting that he has one, right?
Yeah.
He also wrote for GURPS, General Universal Role Playing System, which is like one of the first generic role-playing systems that is settingless and you can run any setting on it. And again, like his brush with fame, he wrote that with Steve Jackson. Steve Jackson, who made Munchkin and Wiz Wars and a bunch of other, like, Steve Jackson is board games, right? He's one of the biggest names, like Monte Cook, Steve Jackson, and then it should be John Ford, right? Like he should be the third guy, but he's not. No one knows who he is. It's very, very mysterious and interesting, like how this ended up happening. I'm sorry that I keep going about this, but like it's really interesting that he also won like poetry awards,
Yeah.
right? Like he wrote long form poetry. Very interesting person.
Well, I think like a huge part of why he, you referenced it, Eden, he could not pick a genre. This was a guy who I think was a real like Renaissance person. Like he had so many interests, so many talents, all of them kind of revolving around writing, but that's not what modern publishing wants. Modern publishing, he didn't want to write a series. There's a quote from Neil Gaiman in a Slate article Ben sent me where he mentions that if The Dragon Waiting had been extended into like 5 books, we'd be talking about John M. Ford the way we talk about George R. R. Martin, because he, is working with a world here that would have that breadth and scope to support a multi-book project that maybe would get a publisher to be like, you're a safe bet. But he didn't want to do that. He wanted to write this, and then he wanted to write, the espionage thriller about a lost Christopher Marlowe play, and then he wanted to write however long aspects. I haven't read it, but it sounds insane and so complicated. I don't know how you would sell that to even the most tolerant publisher in kind of modern SFF.
I think, so maybe like talking about The Dragon Waiting itself, I have to say that I'm very divided on the book. I think it's a flawed book. It's a very good book. I would recommend it to anybody who likes historical fantasy, but I think it's very flawed in many ways. And from what I understand, it's kind of emblematic of Ford's strengths and his weaknesses at the same time.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if you agree with me. Is that what you felt about the book as well?
Yeah. So this was my second time reading through it. And the first time I read through it, I liked it, but it didn't set my world on fire by any means, which was not what I was expecting when I went into it. We'll kind of get into it when we get a little deeper into it, but this is very much like a my shit kind of book. And when I got to it, I was like, I liked that, but I couldn't quite put all the pieces together. And on the second read through, I still feel that way, but I feel like I understand why it's not clicking for me in quite the way I maybe expected it to in like 2021 when I first read it. And I think that, there's some structural issues here. There's some stuff that I think just doesn't work, but it doesn't work in an interesting way. And like you said, Eden, I still think it's a good book. I would recommend it to anyone who had any interest in this kind of stuff.
Yeah, me too, because it was my first time, and I found myself being more drawn to like the character portraits. And then when the action starts happening, I sort of like wasn't as into it. But I do, when I read it, the only thing it reminded me of was Book of the New Sun in terms of like the sort of games that are being played on multiple levels. And so I really enjoyed that. But also, like, to me, I wanted more like character stuff. And while it is there, a lot of it is like, I don't know, kind of allusions or offhands to stuff that happened previously. And then at some point it just becomes like a Richard III plot thing, which we'll talk about. And like, I was less into the plotting and more into like the way he represents character psychology, because I think he does a good job of that. So
I think what the book is trying to do is strike a balance between, the obviously interesting, I'll say it differently. He was very interested in the ideas that he uses the book to surface. Right? The main premise. So maybe we can give like an overview of the plot.
Yeah.
The main premise is Julian the Apostate, which is in our history is like kind of a footnote of a Byzantine emperor. He's not one of the, in mainstream culture, right? He's not Augustus or Julius Caesar or Constantine, right? He's not like one of the known emperors. He not only manages to reign longer, but he also actually rejects Christianity. That's what he's famous for in our timeline as well. That's why he's called the apostate. But he actually does it. Like Christianity, he unmakes Christianity as like the imperial religion and instead fosters this sort of Hellenic, multicultural, multi-religious kind of perception into the empire. The other weird thing is that Islam never takes off because of that. And I don't know if I want my Anglo-Saxon author fantasizing about a world without Islam. That part was kind of like, I don't know about that part. Also, it's kind of like a weird thing to say that Islam never would have happened if Christianity wasn't imperial. I don't know. Anyway, and then so in that setting, like paganism and you know, Britain and other European religions are still around. They weren't suppressed by the Byzantine, the Roman and Byzantine insistence on Christianity. And the world also looks completely different. Like France has been divided into 3 parts technically, but like 2 main parts. And England's position is different. And
crucially, the fact that Christianity is not imposed on the empire in this telling, the Byzantine Empire still exists. The Western Roman Empire still is gone, but the Byzantine Empire has persisted to the point where this book takes place, which is somewhere in our world, in like the 1600s, I want to say. No, 1500s. When were the Medici's around? Yeah. So they persist a great deal longer as a vital force. And they Western Europe is essentially kind of a sphere of influence of the Byzantine Empire.
Which is also like gunpowder. We get gunpowder earlier as well as a result of this. So yeah.
Which like on the historian level, because my official training is as a historian, I have a BA in history. It's funny. Few things are funny about this idea to me. One is that he even chose it. So I would go. There's been a lot of experimentation with the idea. What if Constantine never Christianized the empire? I think that's an interesting question. There's an even more interesting one, I think, which is why did he do it? Like, why would Constantine even choose Christianity as the imperial religion? Why did he choose an imperial religion at all? Is a very interesting question. But then also the space, I wanted the book to stay in Italy, right? Because I think that's a much more interesting question because it's more liminal. Italy was liminal in our reality as well, right? It was this mix and a meeting point of like Christianity, Islam, Byzantine tradition, Roman tradition. It was a very interesting place. By the way, Judaism as well. The first ghettos. Ghetto is an Italian word, right? Because the first ghettos were built in Italy in the 15th century. It was a space for anxiety over the mixture of cultures and so on. But then, that's what I wanted this book to be, like Ford exploring the place of cultural liminality in the setting. And instead is like, what if wizards were doing politics? Right? Like, wouldn't that be wild? Like, what if, by the way, for people listening who haven't read, there's also vampires. What if vampirism was a disease? Like, what would, and those are not boring questions, but like, I kept wanting him to tackle what I thought was the interesting question, which is, how does culture function when it's even more liminal? And there's some part of it, like my favorite character is Dimi, the exiled heir of like the Byzantine Empire, and I wanted more of the cult. They have this
Mithraism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I was like, that's a really interesting concept because Mithraism is super interesting and like how it works with Christianity. So without Christianity, what does that cult look like? What does it mean to be a follower of Mithras? He goes to Britain, right? And there's followers of Mithras there. What's the difference? Are they like the Masons? Do they have like competing rights? Is there differences? And he never really dives into it.
Yeah, Mithraism in this setting has not changed at all in the intervening 1500 years.
Yeah.
And I agree. My training, I have a BA in religious studies, and I felt, similarly, like I literally wrote my undergrad thesis on Julian the Apostate and his
interesting
his attempts to kind of synthesize the bureaucratic ideas of the Christian church with kind of this Hellenic Platonic system he was trying to propagate and how that worked. And I think that there's an issue here, and I think it's kind of a core issue with the idea of alternate history, and that's that he wants this to be the diversion point, but he also wants the diversion point to be that there's magic and vampires because he thinks that's cool and interesting. But then also we get to a point where it's like, okay, but Richard III and the House of Plantagenet are also still here, essentially unchanged from our history. And so the whole alternate history here just it doesn't really feel like it holds up to scrutiny. Like it feels like
it's like a backdrop. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I want to mention that on the other hand, and I opened my previous point about balance. The balance that he is striking, though, is he doesn't fall into the trap of world building, right?
Yeah.
And that's maybe the price that we pay, is that the alternate history stuff is not as fully fleshed out, but the benefit is that we don't have paragraphs explaining to us exactly what's going on, which is really funny. It's really funny that he is Robert Jordan's best friend, the most egregious example of the other side of the spectrum, where it's like, oh, I mentioned the city, time for like 4 pages of exposition on this city. And I'm gonna, the Simpsons meme where the bus driver is tapping the sign. Don't make me tap the sign. My sign that I'm always tapping is M. John Harrison's quote on world building, right? And how world building is dull and world building is the worst, and it's like the worst tendency. And here, John Ford dodges it expertly, right?
Yeah.
That's why it goes, Ben, I agree, goes to Book of the New Sun, because a lot of it is just not explained.
Yeah.
You need to put together the pieces yourself. Not just the setting, also the motivation of some characters. My best example from the book, by the way, my favorite passage from the book is the French court in exile. So the Capets have been exiled by this kind of like tale inside. France has been torn between Byzantine and England, and they retreat to Avignon, which is a really interesting thing to say because of the Avignon papacy and like the exile there. And I love the depiction of all the French lords holding on to their titles, even though they're not worth anything, in the hope that one day they'll return. It's just like a very interesting thing to say about nobility and titles and so on. And the court there that is like super paranoid, but run by this like spy master king who's trying to weave like a web of influence to get back to the grandeur of his house, was really, really good. And the main characters infiltrate the court, right? Because they're looking for some document or other, doesn't matter. And Ford gives you 0 breaks. Like, he explains 0 about what's going on. Are they like lying? Are they telling the truth? Who is deceived? Who's deceiving them? There's like a mysterious figure walking around knocking people out, and he never tells you who that is because it's like a spy from a third faction that's up. And he never does the thing where he's like, oh, and also there was Jared, and Jared was the spy from this kingdom. No, he's like, you figure it out. Right? Like, I gave you the elements, now you put them together.
Yeah, and I think that's the scene where the king has a false king, right? And the real king is dressed as like a jester, which I thought was like kind of indicative of like Ford's whole thing, where it's mostly about misdirection, kind of like, look at this thing over here, and if you're paying attention, you'll notice that the real king is seated in the corner. Like, and so like he always is like moving pieces past you as a reader to kind of like, catch you in the middle, so to speak. He also, and relatedly, in the Slate article, they quote him as saying, I have a horror of being obvious, which I think is why he doesn't, do the world building paragraphs and why he wants to do the misdirection. So
I think that's a very interesting point, because you mentioned, John, you mentioned George R. R. Martin. And I think like it's obvious that Martin read this, right? Like, you can assume that if you're a fantasy, if you meet a fantasy author, they read this book, right? Martin, I like Martin. I just finished watching Game of Thrones, by the way, for the first time, and I had a blast. I really enjoyed myself. I like Martin, but Martin is a bit different because Martin is in love with his own capacity for deceit. So eventually he has to show you the trick, right?
Yeah.
He's like, the entire book, he's sitting in a corner laughing at you while you're reading, and then at the end he says, "You get it? But do you get it? I'll tell you. Okay, I'll explain it to you. You didn't get it. I'll tell you what happened." And Ford is, and again, Martin is a good writer and I like him, but he lacks some confidence. Like, you need really strong confidence to do a Gene Wolfe, right? To do a John Ford, to not tell the audience what the trick was and rely on them to understand it, with the realization that they'll never fully understand it, probably because they didn't write the book. And so Ford does that. Like, he has that confidence to go, did you get it? Well, you didn't. Okay, read it again.
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
He never tells you what's behind door number 3. It's really, really interesting and makes for a very challenging read. going back to the criticism, just take the entire third half of the book, the last, not the third half, the third rather, and just remove it.
Yeah.
All the Richard III like plotting. There was a natural ending point where I don't remember what the crisis is. Oh, the heir becomes sick, right? And the wizard has to rush back and find the healer. Like, do that. There's all sorts of Arthurian like references there. Happens in Wales. There's this ritual, right? They heal the boy or whatever. That's it. That's a really good point to close. No, but instead, he had a beer with Robert Jordan, and he was like, "What if the Tudors, man? What if the Tudors never happened? I gotta put that in the book." You don't. You don't actually.
And also, it seems like he waded into the Richard III innocent discourse. If you read the history notes at the back, because he has a long paragraph where he's like, we usually try to clear Richard III of his nephew's deaths. And in this book, they die because they're vampires, which we'll probably need to explain at some point. But he's like, and that's his explanation for why Richard III is like both like a flawed man, like he's manipulative, but he's not a villain. And he's like basically a realistic Machiavellian leader. And he's coordinating all of these primary documents. And he mentions them briefly at the end of the book. But yeah, it seems like he just really wanted to wade into like Richard III historical discourse. And that's why we had all of that in the back of the book. So.
I mean, to be clear, I think it's an interesting question, right? Maybe start the book there. But you ask two questions. What if Julian the Apostate did the thing, right? Like he won. And then what if the Tudors never happened? And it kind of maybe goes back to Gaiman, like, why isn't this a series? Why not like finish the book and the healing of the boy or the death of the boy or whatever? And then the second book is like, okay, Richard III won the Battle of Bosworth, right? And Henry Tudor never became Henry VII. Okay, super interesting question. So you don't get Henry VIII. So you don't get Anglicanism.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe you don't get the Reformation at all, right? Like, that's a super interesting question for a second book. But to tack it on, like, to the end of this one, it was bizarre.
Yeah, like, one thing I definitely felt even more the second time through the book is how quickly like this moves, like for the scope that this book is trying to have. Like it's only like a little under 400 pages and nothing, like, despite like, again, this book starts off with like 3 like pretty big chapters just establishing like 3 of the main characters like pasts. Then we have kind of a locked door mystery for like 100 pages
in a Swiss hotel. Yeah.
And then we have the bit with the French court, and then we go to England for like the last third, and there's so little time for anything to breathe. Like one thing that really bothered me this time around is, so we have kind of our D&D party of characters who the first part setting up 3 of them, the second part is bringing all 4 of them together, and it's a wizard, an exiled prince who's also like a knight, a doctor who's also like kind of a rogue assassin spy type, and then a vampire with a gun. So yeah, 4 very kind of classic D&D characters. They all get brought together, and then all of a sudden we get to England, and they all like, we have no great idea of like how long they've been traveling together. They're all like missing each other or in love with each other, and it feels like
he splits the party.
Yeah, he splits the party.
For no reason. Like Demi goes north, and what's her face? The Medici, Cynthia, the doctor. Yeah, she discovers Welsh magic. By the way, best chapters in that part by far. Like, Cynthia reckoning with like magic and the Welsh tradition. The scenes where she's in the village and it's Samhain or Beltane or some sort of like
Beltane.
Well, it's Beltane. It's Beltane, and like she reckons with all these figures and so on. Is super interesting, but it just again, like we keep saying, he tries to do too many things. But like, this is still a good book, so I want to say some good stuff from that. The magic is fantastic.
Yeah.
He keeps the tradition of like not explaining anything, and like magic it's not magic realist per se, but it's not high magic, right? There are no rules, there's no systems, there's no spell books. Right? It's all like folk magic. tied into, the classic magical rules like draws to like and the power of three, and there's always a sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
He leans very heavily on Ursula Le Guin's rule, right, which is magic can't be useful. Right? Like the price always has to exceed what the magic does, otherwise the world breaks, right? If magic is cheap, then magic duels just do whatever they want, right? They just go around controlling everything. In this setting, it's like you can do a lot of things, but the price is going to be awful, and it's going to be terrible. And specifically, I really liked. It's a Welsh name, so I'm probably mispronouncing it. Well, or however you're supposed to pronounce it. Well,
I think it's almost howl from what I
Could
looked
be.
up,
Yeah.
which I think might also be a subtle reference back to the book of Howl's Moving Castle, which is
interesting.
also about a Welsh wizard.
Howl, yeah. So the trope is very much recognizable, right? Like the corrupt wizard, that he's good, but he has to do evil things to serve the plan, right? Like basically the ends justify the means, right? Like writ large. But he keeps going one step further with it than I've ever seen it. Like Howl he's like fucked up, right? Like he drains
Yeah.
people of their energies.
Yeah.
He's willing to sacrifice like everyone. Every person he meets is the only people he knows are all like manipulating him, or he's manipulating them. He has no friends. He has no capacity for trust. He only has capacity for manipulation. It's like very interesting to the extent to which he took that kind of like corrupt wizard trope and ran with it, considering it's one of the main characters. Right? It's a protagonist.
Yeah.
But
it's someone who's we spend time in his head. Like we see what he's thinking. He's not kind of a Gandalf where kind of the structuring absence of his personality is part of it. Like we don't see his thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that real quick and just say I feel like all of the characters are like archetypes in some way, but he gives them just enough of like a backstory because like, the wizard, the corrupt wizard, there's basically Aragorn, the true king, but he does not want to be king. He just wants to serve somebody. Then there's the healer who is compared to, John, you corrected me with the pronunciation, like Rhiannon, I think.
Yeah.
Cynthia is compared to Rhiannon, and then the vampire, well, I mean, he's Dracula. like there's like, I don't know, there's like various archetypes that like also have backstories, so it's not just like a stock figure. But I think he's like consciously kind of playing with like an archetype here in a way that I think is like, fun and not like, I don't know, route, I would say.
Well, again, I think that's kind of where the D&D influence comes in. Like he's taking, like the wizard, but we're going to make it a little bit more interesting because I don't want to just play the same wizard again. I want to do a new spin on it. And I think it's also really interesting, what you were saying, Eden, about the magic. I think that's also really interesting with what this book kind of wants to say about Empire, because Howl starts off as like it's a very classic trope. He's this farm boy, or in his case, lives in like a country inn as like their pot stirrer basically, and he discovers that he has this special gift, and he wants to follow that, and he finds out not just that can he do magic, but he's also kind of like a lost prince himself. And he follows this Byzantine wizard who he has no real reason to trust to learn magic. And it's implied that he goes off to the Empire. We never go to Byzantium in this book. There's no scene set there. There's no characters who are, have a loyalty to Byzantium that they're, kind of on the side of. It's implied like terrible things happen to him there, and that's kind of why he has been turned into this manipulative person, because he has been in the belly of the beast, so to speak, and he's trying to, the real kind of thing he's working towards at the end of this is an independent England that can push off Byzantine influence.
Yeah.
Which is, it's also interesting the way it explores, the main premise of the book, right? Which is the relationship of empire and knowledge and the practice of culture, right? Like for us, for people living with modern imperialism, right? Imperialism and empire is synonymous with the need to structure reality, right? Empire imposes knowledge structures. By the way, I'm reading The Saint of Bright Doors, which is also a fantasy novel that plays around with Empire. Extremely good, extremely weird. Also, like, says less than many other books. And it's all about like this structuring of reality by Empire. And so, but Ford kind of goes back and says, well, that's not what Empire always was, right? When we say the Roman Empire, we obviously don't mean modern imperialism, right? And the Roman Empire, for those of the listeners who don't know, was multicultural and multi-religious for a huge chunk of its existence, right? There was like a state religion, and you had to pay service to it, and you had to recognize it, but that's about it. As long as you agreed that, only the priests of the emperor are allowed to divine auguries, you could believe whatever else you wanted. And Rome had rising and falling periods of cults in Rome itself, right? Like the Isis cult, and
Sol
so on.
Victus too, but that's like
Sol
later.
Victus,
yeah,
that's later. But again, it's the same kind of thing. Mithraism, of course, and they were very agile in incorporating these religions into their narrative of imperial rule, right? Oh, no worries. You have like the Isis cult, where Osiris is this hero who is born again and protects the people. That's obviously the emperor of the Roman Empire, right? And you have Mithras. Well, Mithras' chosen is obviously the emperor of the Roman Empire, right? Like they had no trouble incorporating these things. And when they chose Christianity, going back to my question from earlier, they exchanged the power that gave them with a different sort of power, right? With the power that a monotheistic and jealous religion gives you, which is the power of hierarchy, social control, control over knowledge creation, and so on. And Ford, I think, very interestingly, this is all in the background of the book. Again, because there's no exposition, Powell doesn't sit down with Demi and discuss the nature of power, right? Which again is how Jordan would have done it. Instead, I'm shitting on Robert Jordan today. He deserves it, so it's fine. Instead, it's in the background of the storyline of like, I don't want you to imagine the empire without Christianity collapsing. I want you to imagine how a successful empire with multiculturalism built into it might look like. He could have done something, quote unquote, hippie, right? Like, oh, the empire remained multicultural, so empire is fine. Right? Like he could have said, look at this utopian setting where we're on the moon or whatever because the Byzantine Empire stayed multicultural. No, he's like, those guys were assholes anyway. Whether they were Christian or not, they were power hungry, money hungry autocrats. Let's see what that looks like in a multicultural setting, which is super, super, super interesting. By the way, one thing we didn't mention, Christianity still does exist in the book.
Yes.
They've been relegated to be like roadside bandits and religious fanatics in the wild northern lands of Scotland.
Well, what did you, I was asking John about this. What did you think about Mary's Christianity? Because the prayers that she says, I was looking at that annotations website, and they're like, no Christian has ever said this, but her prayers are all about love and contact and becoming flesh, which I think is an interesting kind of interpretation of Christianity from Mary being the faith healer who is Christian, who is not a roadside bandit, but they're also, roadside bandit Christians who disfigure the face with crosses, which Ford also doesn't spell out. He just says that they disfigure the face in a certain way.
Because crucially, the characters don't recognize the cross as like a particularly important symbol.
Yeah, it's just another symbol, right? I think that's him, again, trying to bite off more than he can chew by asking the question, well, what would Christianity look like if it was never adopted by the Roman Empire?
Yeah.
And he suggests like two paths that it could have gone on. And again, he maybe is like exposing his simplicity a bit. Like he's basically saying there are two parts to Christianity, right? There's the religion of love and care and empathy and virtue and so on. The religion of, Christ washing the feet of the poor. And then there's the religion of I bring not peace but a sword. I tear brother from brother and father from sons and so on. Like there's the righteous, vengeful version of Christianity. The answer to the question is much more complicated, right? There aren't two religions. It's the same religion that can do both things. But we can have a whole podcast, like I'm sure, John, we could talk about that for like 6 hours, right? Like how is Christianity able to, like the interesting question is not, oh, look, Christianity is two religions. The interesting question is, how can it be one religion? Like, how do you square, I bring a sword, and also we are the meek, we will inherit the earth. Like that's the interesting thing about Christianity. And Ford here is like, what if I took those two elements and I split them? Mary is like healing, compassion, empathy, and then the brigands are like the vengeful sort of Christianity.
And her name being Mary is fairly significant, like the Virgin Mary. So like, yeah, I think he definitely was like splitting those two in terms of that,
which is a choice. Again, he's biting off more than he could chew. I would love to see an alternate universe, not our setting, where Ford had the time, had the patience to like sit down and really like lay these books out, and then use each one to explore one of the settings. Like imagine again a program for a better dragon waiting. I'll say it that way. Dragon waiting book 1 is all Italy, right? Then you dig deep into like the Medici versus the Sforza. You see the campaign all the way through, right? Like there's results. And then the second book, okay, they flee Italy and they go to France. And then you're in the court of the French king, and there's machinations and they come to fruition. And what's going on with all this moon magic, right? The translation of the text is really cool. The teleportation, like you dive deeper into that.
Yeah.
And then they get the text. The book ends when they get the text. And the third book is in England, right? Then you dive deeper into like all the Richard III stuff, or not. Maybe you skip that. You dive deeper into all the folklore and the magic and all that stuff. And then the fourth book, it brings it all together. Because obviously, like when the book was ended, I was like, okay, but what about Dimi?
Yeah.
Like, what about the Byzantine Empire? He has to go back and reforge the sword, right? He has to, I don't know. So that's another suggestion.
Yeah, Dimi is an interesting character because I thought Ford's portrayal of sort of like a working stiff who his job happens to be to kill people was really interesting because like you get this kind of like despair at the realization that this is all he'll ever be, but then he sort of like rises to the occasion. It's like, I am this person. I have to serve someone. And obviously, like, I liked his chapter a lot because these character introduction chapter, because like Mithraism is like laid over his brain. And so he's always thinking about things in terms of like sacrifice and apotheosis and sort of like coming together. And like, then, we don't get that as much when he becomes basically like a working stiff, more or less. But yeah, he was a fascinating character, and it would have been interesting to see if he goes back. Cause like, again, that's a whole other book, him just being like a traveling bandit. Maybe he never goes back. So
yeah. What could have been?
Yeah. No, I agree with you, Eden. Like I just, through this whole book, I was just like, I wish anything here was being given like the time and effort it deserves to be, like all it can be. Because there's so many, again, just tantalizing things he drops. There's the passage where Howell is thinking about like the 8 wizards or 6 wizards he knows who have never been corrupted by the power. And each one of those is written in such a way where it's like, oh, there could be a whole book about this character and how Howell knows them and what they've done.
Yeah, like one is a Taoist, one is a Russian who worships icons. Like there's all these like, interesting details in that one paragraph.
And go ahead.
No, go on.
Well, I was going to say like the vampire character, what's his name? Gregory. Like he doesn't get a character intro chapter the way the others do it. I think that's on purpose, but at the same time, it's like, well, it also does feel like he gets short shrift compared to the other characters because we get all this background on them and then he does not get introduced.
I think to move to maybe my recommendation for people who, liked the Dragon Waiting or will read it following this episode and kind of want to dig deeper into alternative history is 2 books. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to choose 2. I hope that's okay. And I'm going to do what Ford did with Christianity. I'm going to take the aspects that are good about the Dragon Waiting, and both books are going to take a different approach and do it better, I think, than what Ford was trying to do here. The first one is Spear by Nicola Griffith. Nicola Griffith is she's kind of like John Ford, right? She's very important, not as important as him, but very important, but kind of unknown. She wrote Ammonite, which we covered on Death Sentence. It won a bunch of awards as well. Very important feminist science fiction novel from the early 90s. But she also wrote Spear. She also wrote Hild, a bunch of alternate history, but Spear is specifically about Percival. It just so happens to be that Percival is like my favorite Arthurian knight. But Spear is completely gender reversed. So Percival is a woman. Well, not completely. Merlin is still a man. Nimue is still a woman, but Percival is reversed. And it's all about, Percival, or this Percival standing character growing up in the wild with a witch of a mom. I won't spoil who she is. There's like a whole thing. If you're a student of those histories, you'll recognize it immediately. And it's also it's a retelling of Arthur, like going back to the Welsh roots of the myth, which is very popular nowadays, right? Like to say, actually, King Arthur was co-opted by the English, right? And it's originally like a Welsh myth. So she does that really well. And it's an example of going smaller, right? If this was written by Ford, then Nimue would get her own third of the book, and Merlin would get his own third, and Percival would get his own third, and it would be like a mess. It would be like the sprawling thing. But instead, it's just Percival, just her coming of age story, just her journey and her experience with the artifacts, right? Like the Grail and Excalibur and so on. And it's really well written, and it's small. So that's one approach to alternate history and like retellings and so on. The second approach is grander, has more world building, but it's much more focused and knows what it wants to say. And I think when you talk about alternate histories or historical fantasy, you have to bring up Guy Gavriel Kay.
Yes.
Guy Gavriel Kay is the Tolkien of historical fantasy, alternate histories. Like, no, this is like not my opinion. This is like objective fact. This guy has, I don't know how many books published now. He's Canadian. He has dozens of books, and they're all alternate history. Well, he doesn't really change the historical events. He's closer to what actually happened, but he retells them in interesting ways. So his claim to fame, like his origin, is the Fiona of Our Tapestry, which is, by the way, Byzantine fantasy, right? About the Byzantine Empire. He published this, by the way, contemporaneously with Ford. He published The Summer Tree in 1984. I actually don't like the Fiona of Our Tapestry. I mean, I think it's good, but it's kind of like meat and potatoes historical fantasy. And then I'm going to cheat again. And I'm actually going to recommend 3 books from him. This is the Death Sentence promise, right? You don't get one thing. You get like a million things. He has a lot of books. But I think there's a run of 3 of them in the center of his career. There's another book in there, Roll With Me. I'm ignoring it for the narrative. For Arbon, published in 1992. The Lions of Al-Rassan, published in 1995. And The Last Light of the Sun, published in 2004. So A Song for Arbon is one of the saddest books you'll ever read. And Ford kind of has that like historical melancholy.
Yeah.
Right? Like the disappearing world, the dying of magic, and so on. Arbon is about Provence. And it's inspired by medieval Provence, and specifically the Albigensian Crusade. So another like religiously focused historical fantasy. Very, very good. Very, very sad. The main character is a troubadour. All about like this bard kind of personality. Lots of duels, romance, and so on. Very, very good. The Lions of Al-Rassan, which I think is his best book, is around the Reconquista. The Reconquista of Islamic Spain by northern Christian Spain. So again, religion is in the center. And he has Jewish characters. I mean, they're not Jewish because it's an alternate kind of setting, but he has like a Jewish doctor. Very, very interesting character. Beautiful book. Also about like disappearing. So he takes also the interesting stance of like, was it a good thing that the Reconquista happened? like what society was replaced by Christian society, and he depicts Andalusian Islam, Spanish, Iberian society as what it was: deeply multicultural, deeply liminal, right? Like if we're looking at it from a Jewish perspective, the lives of Jews deteriorated substantially after the Reconquista, right? They lived better under Islamic Andalusian rule than Christian rule. And then the last one, Last Light of the Sun, is about the Viking invasions around Alfred the Great, and specifically plays a lot with the place and importance of Ireland, with the mainland. And Ireland is this, like the land where the last light of the sun is, right? Like this fantastical land, the land beyond the waters and so on. I mean, Camelot and Avalon is in Ireland, right? When Welsh people write about an island in the mist, they're writing about Ireland, right? So he does, and there it's more of a character exploration kind of book, but it does have paganism and Christianity and so on. And those books are big. Spear is small. This is big. But Kay has a much clearer vision for what he wants to say about the periods. Right? Instead of going in all these different directions that Ford does, there's less fantasy. Magic is only hinted at. It's more realist. But he has a lot to say about these societies, what was lost when they were lost, what was bad about them, what was good about them. So if you're interested in historical fantasy and like historical retellings, you can't go wrong with Kay. It's like a very basic bitch kind of recommendation. Like, this guy is like the first thing you come up against. I'm just looking at his awards. So importantly, and how you know he's big, he won the World Fantasy Award, but he also won Grown Up Awards, right? So he won like the Prix Aurora Award, which is the French kind of like what's the recommendation? It's the French Hugos, right? So it's not like just the Hugos. It's more it's Canadian, like French Canadian, but it's more widely regarded as like prestigious. And he's won like he's a knight in Canada. Okay,
Wow,
he's
really?
anointed to the Order of Canada. Okay, so he's like big. Okay?
Would you say that he does less like what ifs, and it's more just like here's a very particular like look at this like you said, a dwindling time or place?
Yeah, it's more exactly. It's not what ifs. It's all very true to what actually happened.
Cool.
Right? Like the Reconquista happens, right, in Lions of Al Rassan, but he zooms in and says, how did this affect people? Which is, by the way, what's missing from Ford, I think, as well. There are no commoners in Ford's writing. Very few. Only in the village.
Yeah.
And the rest of the people are nobles, knights, wizards, mercenaries. There aren't like common people, except in the village, and it's one of the best passages, right? Where he explores like actual people and their rituals and so on. A is all about like, okay, power and big men, great men history, but also what's left below that and behind that.
Yeah.
What stories are to be found when you read deeper into history. And I know I spoke more about Kay, but also read Griffith, read Spear. Spear is also very, 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 very good. Those are my two recommendations.
I'll echo that recommendation of Spear. Eden, I read that last year on your recommendation, and I liked it a lot. I can't say it's my favorite like Arthurian retelling, but that's also a genre in and of itself. So, but yeah, Lions of El Rassan is the only K I've read, but I also did really like that. Ben, like to kind of your question, like he uses kind of the fantasy to maybe tell like a more narratively engaging story. Like one of the main characters in Lions of El Rassan is like clearly El Cid, the famous Spanish general.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And rather than being, this gives him the freedom to put him in, like this love triangle with these other characters and tell a more engaging, dramatic story by not getting bogged down and maybe like the actual details of history as they happened in a way that maybe other historical fiction writers would feel obligated to.
And one last thing I want to say about Kay. very important for me because people don't talk about this enough. He was Christopher Tolkien's right hand in putting together the Silmarillion.
Really?
wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
For Christopher Tolkien, there's a Canadian connection to Christopher Tolkien's family, and they know the case. And Guy was enlisted once Tolkien had died, and Christopher was made the executor of his estate. He was drafted to help Christopher put the Silmarillion together.
Huh.
And the Silmarillion, you can't see it because it's dark and also the resolution is not good enough. But I have like 4 different editions of the Silmarillion on the shelves there. Silmarillion is one of my all-time favorite pieces of work. And like I discovered this after I fell in love with Kay. One of my best friends in high school, we were reading Song of Ice and Fire. And he was like, you gotta read Lions of Al Rassan, man. You have to read this. I was like, I'm not really into it. I like history, but it's not my thing. Is like, don't think about it, just read it. And I fell in love with Kay. And then years later, I found out he's partially responsible for the Silmarillion existing. So,
wow,
big kudos to him. By the way, we could do an entire episode on Silmarillion and specifically Welsh mythology. It's another connection between Ford and Tolkien.
Yeah, and I think Ford does take a minute to spell out the Welshness, like you said, of King Arthur. I had a question. This might just be a reading comprehension question. Where did the medallions come from? So this is related because when they're going through the Welsh countryside, Howl finds these medallions that have a red dragon and a white dragon. And obviously this is kind of like a stand-in for the War of the Roses. But was it ever explained where they come from, or were we just supposed to be I guess they have them?
It's not the War of the Roses.
Okay.
So it's a very good question, and it's like a Gene Wolfe thing, right? Like you'd have to ask Ford, but Ford is dead.
Right. Yeah.
But I think it's a reference to Merlin's prophecy, right? So
yeah, the red and the white dragons.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the famous prophecy from Arthurian myth from Merlin. I'm looking for the text. Because it talks about here we go. Its cavernous dens shall be occupied by the white dragon, and that's supposedly the Saxons.
Oh yeah, okay.
And the red dragon will be overrun by the white one. For Britain's mountains and valleys shall be leveled, and the streams in its valleys shall run with blood. Right. So I mean, Arthur. This could be a whole other episode, right? Like we could talk about all this stuff. And I'm actually deep into it because last year, another book that's on my shelf that you can't see is Tolkien's translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Cool.
And then I also have the Mabigonion, which is the Welsh cycle of myth. And I just ordered what's it called? The poem, the eulogy for heroes, which is the first mention of Arthur, the Gododin. The Gododin is like a Welsh. It's like one of my pet projects is like digging deeper into Welsh mythology, and it's all the origins of English mythology and Welsh mythology. So Arthur has a lot of iterations, and one of those iterations, which Ford also deploys. This is my excuse for talking about this, right? I'm tying it back to Dragon Waiting. Also deploys is Arthur as a repeller of invasion, right? The English went and took Arthur and made him the last scion of Roman excellency in England, right? Arthur's death is like the death knell of the Roman golden age in England, right? And then, but the Welsh version is Arthur is the protector of like Welsh beliefs and Welsh independence against invasion by the Anglo-Saxons, right? And then you have other versions where a lot of people conflate Alfred the Great as an Arthurian figure. I mean, I don't blame them, right? Both of his brothers and his father were killed in battle. He escaped to a swamp where he built a fort, like in the middle of nowhere, attacking from out of the fog and repelling the Saxon, like that. He is Arthur, whether we want it or not, right? So there's all sorts of versions of Arthur, and interestingly deployed either for Empire, again, a tie into Dragon Waiting, right? Like the nostalgia for Roman excellence and so on. And also an important part of Arthur is he comes back. right? The
He
once
will
and
come
future
back.
king.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the Roman grandeur will return to England, right? But on the other hand, like Welsh resurgence and so on. And in the last 2 decades, where anti-imperialism has become more and more popular, which is a good thing. We're all anti-imperialists on this podcast, I hope.
Yes.
There's been a lot of revival of the original Welsh stories as calls for Welsh independence.
Yeah.
Right? Griffith in Spear does it as well. She says Percival is a Welsh name, right? And Gawain Owen is Gawain, right? And Gawain is a Welsh name. Gawain shows up for the first time in the Mabinogion, right? And there's also all these retracings of the Welsh resurgence in these tellings. Now, let's tie it back to the dragon waiting. And again, why did Ford do this? Why is the book called The Dragon Waiting? I was expecting the book to end with Welsh resurgence. I was expecting Howl to like do a Scooby-Doo, right? And like take off the mask and go, it was me, Gawain, the whole time, right? I thought it was the wizard that teaches him, the kid, to be a wizard. I thought he killed the kid and is pretending to be him, all to bring back, because that wizard was the advisor of
Owain Glyndŵr.
Thank you. So the last Welsh rebellion against the English kings. So I was expecting him to go, actually, this was all a manipulation for me to wake up the dragon and declare Wales as an independent kingdom. So why is it called The Dragon Waiting? It's so bizarre. And it's hinted at beneath the surface, right? All the scenes in the village, all the scenes with the wizard, something's coming back.
In
maybe
the medallions,
Wales. The medallions. Like, where is it? Why isn't there a second book where actually Wales comes back? It's bizarre. It's such a weird.
Well, and honestly, that would fit. That would fit with the like. Imagine you're resisting the Byzantine Empire. Well, wouldn't it make sense to call for Welsh independence? Like, it would fit with the overall theme. I feel like.
I mean, this might be, but part of it is that I think, and this might be like Ford again. I don't know what his politics exactly were. I'm guessing as a white guy in America in the 80s, they were at best a little muddled.
Yeah.
But the Welsh rebellion that's led here by the Tudors it's a color revolution. It's being manipulated. The dragon that's conjured at the end, the red dragon, is a product of magic by another Byzantine wizard who's being sent basically to soften up England for the Byzantines to come through and retake the other half of France and presumably then England. And so I think maybe the dragon waiting is the fact that maybe, yes, Welsh independence is good and should happen eventually, but it's not yet. I don't know. I don't know again enough about Ford's politics, but it might be that that dream has to be deferred.
Yeah, could be. Yeah. It's an interesting question, especially with all the Arthurian references that it's swimming in. It's a very interesting question of like, so, Dimi, you said he's Aragorn, but Aragorn is just Arthur. Right? So by the law of transference, like Dimi is Arthur, but again, the sword is not reforged, right? Like the king doesn't come back. Maybe we're not giving Ford enough credit, and he was playing with those tropes, right? He was saying, "Oh, you expected this to be like a Lord of the Rings, the king comes back and rides to save everyone, but actually, I'm doing a historical thing, and I'm saying in history, even if magic exists, there are no returning kings, there are no waking dragons, right? It's all politics and machinations and intrigue and so on."
Yeah, the dragon again. It's an illusion. It's an enchantment.
Yeah.
It's not. It doesn't save anyone. Like, it kills thousands of people as it falls apart.
Yeah,
well, like, you go ahead, Ian.
No, I was just going to say Wales is like a red herring, right?
Yeah.
Like a red that comes back, right? Like the red fabric for the bull, right? Like, you think this is what's going to happen, but instead I'm going to do this thing.
Yeah.
I did particularly like, though, the fact where Howl says that if you sort of conjure another dragon to face the dragon, it makes it more real, which I think is kind of like a nice metaphor for like imperial power and resistance. Because sort of like once like you sort of grant that like maybe Welsh independence is a thing, then suddenly we have these two things as opposed to just one. And so I think like that, like he probably didn't intend it to imply that, but I think that sort of maps onto it nicely in terms of like, yeah, like, resistance to imperial control or something like that.
Now I want to do, this is the last thing I'm going to say. Now I want to read aspects, and I want to throw aspects back on the dragon waiting and ask like, what does Ford's like later writing tell us about his earlier works? This is another thing that's important to remember. Like the Dragon Waiting is the third novel that he published. And he wrote so many things after it. So I think it would be quite interesting to read. I think after it, he didn't write any fantasy, right? A Final Reflection is Star Trek.
Yeah, that's the Klingon one.
How Much for Just a Planet is Star Trek.
Yeah, the Gilbert and Sullivan one.
Scholars of Night is the spy thriller.
Yes.
Casting Fortune.
Well, I guess there is the Last Hot Time. Is that before or after Dragon Waiting? Because that is fantasy.
That's after it, yeah.
Okay.
That one,
and
I don't
Aspects
know if
is fantasy. So I guess two more fantasy books.
I don't know if you looked at Last Hot Time, but Last Hot Time is really interesting because like I'm fairly certain Ford grew up in a rural area in Indiana, and then he moved to Bloomington, Indiana to go to IU. And in Last Hot Time, it's about like a rural kid going to the city and realizing that like magic happens in the city. So it's sort of like a city awakening novel. Also, side note, one of the best lines in Slate.com is that Ford was apparently like a kid genius, and he went to IU when he was 16, and he racked up like $3,000 in library fines that his father had to pay, and he was not going to class. He was just like dungeon mastering, like he was just like running dungeon master games and just like checking out every book at the library and not returning them, which is like an incredible image to me personally. But yeah,
that's phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, Eden, I'm guessing since you said that's the last thing you were going to say, you have to get going. So I know Ben and I still need to do our recommendations, but if you need to
go for it. And then there was like my final thing to say about the Dragon Waiting. you do your recommendation. I'm sure that'll be interesting.
All right. Well, Ben, do you want to take the first one? You want me to take it?
Yeah, I can take the first one. I think I'm gonna have a slightly basic bitch recommendation. Also, I just honestly I haven't read a whole lot of fantasy, and I think it most reminded me of Book of the New Sun, just because, as we've been saying, there's a horror of being obvious. And with Book of the New Sun, it doesn't quite sort of sprawl out of hand the way we've been saying it kind of does at Dragon Waiting. But you get the same kind of attention to detail, the same sort of like concealment of revelation that I think is really interesting with Dragon Waiting. And I also want to add one other thing as a roundabout example. You should definitely listen to the Velvet Underground if you haven't, because as Eden said, like the thing with the Velvet Underground, like they said with this book, only 100 people bought the record, but each one of them made a band. And I think one of the big things with Velvet Underground is if you listen to them, they merged like rock and pop music with like avant-garde repetition, distortion, and like atonality. And I think with Dragon Waiting, you get like this nice array of techniques that people sort of ran with later. And I think that's to me where I see the biggest Velvet Underground link. So Book of the New Sun, Wolf, and then listen to the Velvet Underground if you haven't, because both great. So
I think.
All right.
I just want to say, like, recommending Book of the New Sun is a thing that I always have a problem doing, because it's kind of like recommending that someone ruin their life by going down this insane rabbit hole of, like, Death Sentence has 5 episodes. Each one of them is almost 2 hours long, about what the hell is going on in Book of the New Sun. And we only scratched like 30-40% of everything you could talk about. Like, Book of the New Sun is like handing someone House of Leaves, or I want to say like the Kabbalah, or like Zohar, like some mystic text, and going, yeah, you should read this one like on a Sunday when you have nothing. Like, it's so it's not as sprawling as Dragon Waiting, but like Dragon Waiting goes across like breadth, but Book of the New Sun goes down. But like you can keep reading into it. I totally understand like the overlap and how they're similar 100%. But if you're listening to this, you should 100% read the Book of the New Sun. But when you get through the first 50 pages and you're like, what the hell is actually happening here, just know that that's intentional. It's not you. It's the book that's doing it to you.
All right. So that leaves me. I'm going to recommend something a little on a different note. I'm going to recommend some good historical fiction that's not alternative. I'm going to go with a novel that was super pivotal to me growing up, one of my favorite books, and that's Gore Vidal's Julian, which is a biographical novel about Julian the Apostate by one of the messiest bitches in American letters, Gore Vidal, who, if you have not read anything by him, incredibly weird guy, American aristocrat, mid-century bisexual icon.
Some of the sickest burns, especially when he pissed off Norman Mailer and Norman Mailer punched him, and from the floor he said, "Words failed Norman again." Because he's just lying on the floor. Apparently, which apparently happened, but it might be exaggeration. So yeah.
But funny guy, good book, highly recommended.
I don't think I've ever been recommended Gore Vidal before. That's very, very funny.
He's hilarious because he's also like incredibly cutting, but it's just in a very funny way. So like, yeah.
Awesome.
Well, Eden, before we kind of wrap things up, is there anything you want to plug? Anything you're working on right now?
I'm always working on something. Death Sentence's next episode is going to be about The Saint of Bright Doors, which is also sort of a recommendation. It has a lot of interesting things. I'm a cheater. I always do
the Death
this.
Sentence Promise, like you said, you get a lot of stuff.
You get a lot of stuff. Very good book. So we're going to do that. And I'm working, this will take me longer. I'm working on a solo episode comparing Harry Martinson's Aniara, which is a science fiction epic poem, and Deep Wheel Orcadia, which is a more recent science fiction epic poem written in Orkney.
Wow.
Yeah, and Harry Martinson wrote his in Swedish. So, of course, I'm reading the translations. I don't speak Swedish or Orkney. But I want to compare the two and kind of see what I can find. First of all, about science fiction epic poem. By the way, Ford won an award for an epic science fiction poem.
Was that the Camelot one?
I think so. I haven't read it. I just know he's on the list of winners.
If it is that one, he supposedly wrote it on a Christmas card. I honestly think like Ford was one of the, it was like a pre-poster because he was just like writing stuff everywhere. Like he was posting blog posts, he was writing like note cards, like he was writing like he had like a poster's brain, I feel like. So
yeah, it's called Winter Solstice Camelot Station. By the way, sorry, again, the Death Sentence Promise, lots of stuff. The award is called the Riesling Award, and it's after Robert Heinlein's character, the blind poet Riesling from the Green Hills of Earth. I'm famously a Robert Heinlein hater. But the award has some really interesting things on it. It has The Well of Bane by Ursula Le Guin, very, very good. Gene Wolfe is the inaugural winner for The Computer Iterates the Greater Trumps, which is also very good. Other people on the list include stalwarts like Joe Haldeman, Gregory Stewart, Bruce Boston. If you don't know who these people are, they're all like very famous science fiction authors inside of certain circles. Catherine Valente, which I'm a big fan of. And Neil Gaiman is on here. Mary Soon Lee, who's also like a big name today. So it's a very interesting list of people who wrote long form science fiction or horror or fantasy poems. And our boy John Ford is on it as well. So, yeah.
All right. Well, those are both really interesting projects you're working on. Really looking forward to hearing those. Listeners, if you've never checked Death Sentence out before, please do. Highly recommended here. And yeah, I guess I'll say what our next episode is going to be on, since Ben and I sat down and planned out the next couple of months recently. Our next episode here in 2 weeks is going to be on The Fraud by Zadie Smith. So we hope you'll all join us here back in the stacks for that.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Eden, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah,
really a huge pleasure to talk to you. And if you ever want to come back on, just reach back out.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.